I'm Ken Rockwell with KenRockwell.com. Let's take a look at Canon's 2024 issue RF 35mm f1.4L VCM. First off, what is VCM? VCM stands for voice coil motor, and what's that? It's simply the technology that's been used in almost every loudspeaker and headphone since the late 1800s, where you take a coil of wire, glue it to something you want to move, like a speaker cone or lens elements inside, put it next to a magnet, and when you run electrical currents through it, it creates forces just like an electromagnet and moves things around. It's as simple as that. It's a simpler way to do it and quieter and potentially faster than the ultrasonic motors or stepper motors that have been used in the past. This lens is dual purpose. It's intended both for shooting video as well as stills, so it can have some weird ergonomics for either application because of that. Its optics are superb. Let's take a look at some of the pictures I've made with this lens, which are the sort of pictures for which you want the lens like this. As a fast, sharp lens, it is superb for taking pictures in low light, especially if things don't move or if they do move. In this case, this is taken with my R5 Mark II. With this lens wide open at f1.4, handheld at 1/10 of a second at auto ISO 320. This lens is not stabilized, but it works great with in-camera stabilization. This lens has no coma. In other words, bright points of light at the corners of the picture stay completely as points of light. They do not become blobs, as 35mm f1.4 lenses often have done ever since they were first invented. This lens has superb optics, and as you can see, the little points of light here at the Pacific Beach Pier by moonlight look as they should. This is shot with my R5 Mark II. This is with the lens wide open at f1.4, handheld at 1/8 of a second at auto ISO 640. Here's something else it's good for: walking around at night and taking pictures. This is an hotel at dusk in Pacific Beach, California. This is shot wide open at f1.4 on my R5 Mark II, handheld at 1/10 of a second at ISO 1600. You'll notice what's great about this lens, as opposed to one of my slower zooms that I would usually shoot, is that I can be shooting at ISO 1600 at this shutter speed rather than a higher ISO with a slower lens. Thus, I get cleaner images for all the things that you've seen. All the shots I've showed you so far, sure, I could shoot these with a slower lens, but I'd have to use a higher ISO. Here's the same hotel with a ghost girl on her phone, wide open at 1.4, handheld at 1/8 of a second at auto ISO 640. And if I shot this with a slower lens, I would either have a longer shutter speed and the ghost would become more ghost-like, or I'd have to shoot at a higher ISO. Now, usually I can shoot at slower speeds and get away with a little of that, but again, if you've got anything actually moving that you want to render sharp, that's where the f1.4 comes handy. Here's an example that's not really requiring this lens. This is shot, as all these are, with my R5 Mark II. This is stopped down to f2.8 to give a little bit of depth of field at ISO 1250. The whole point of this lens today is to let us shoot at large apertures and higher shutter speeds, or lower ISOs for either sharper or cleaner images, or to be able to stop motion better. Honestly, I usually shoot everything with my personal favorite, my 24-240, which works great and has built-in stabilization because I usually shoot things that don't move. So for landscapes and so forth, with just this on my camera, I don't need to carry this around. The reason I will use this is if I'm just going out at night to wander around town and see what there is to see. On the other hand, another great choice for that application is this 28-70 f2.8. This is a very inexpensive and lightweight lens. And for most people, I think grabbing one of these, throwing it in your bag, it's lighter, a little bit lighter than the 35. And about the same size or smaller, depending on if it's in the shooting position or not. But this is a special purpose lens. The history of the 35 1.4 was built in the days of film. And if any of you guys can still remember when all we had was film, it was really tough taking pictures in the dark. You couldn't just grab your iPhone and take a picture under moonlight. Even indoors, you had to be shooting ISO 400 film, which is really grainy and gross, and you wouldn't want to use that in daylight. And then you'd shoot at about 2.8 at a 30th indoors. By grabbing a 35 1.4, you could shoot at 1.4 at a 60th or a 125th, and stop action. If there were people moving, you're shooting newspapers, for instance, you don't have to tell people, oh, please stop and freeze for this picture. That's why the 35-1.4 became a standard lens used in every photographer's bag while we still had film. Today, it's a very special purpose lens because it doesn't have much need. The reason why is our digital cameras go to super high ISOs and look just great, and we also have stabilization for still photos in our other lenses. It's also not a lens to use if you want soft backgrounds. Why? Well, sure, it's an f1.4 lens, but more important than the f-stop is the focal length. A 50mm f1.8 lens has softer backgrounds than this lens does. An 85mm f1.8 has far softer backgrounds than this lens has. Because this lens is so wide, backgrounds don't get that far out of focus, and therefore, if you're really looking for soft backgrounds, that's not an excuse to tell your friends that that's why you bought this lens. Just the 50-1.8 is all you need, or an 85-1.8. Some of its quirks are, the voice coil motor system does not lock down the internals of the lens when it's not attached to a camera or when your camera is turned off. So when I shake the lens, it always sounds like there's something flopping around inside that's not tied down, and that's because there is something inside that's not tied down. It's half the lens elements that are part of the focus system, and for some reason it doesn't lock them down when it turns off. That's weird. Sony lenses are usually like that. Now, Canon has a lens that does that. It could drive some people crazy. It's nice that it has an aperture ring, but this aperture ring is mostly for video and won't work on most of the cameras except for the R5 Mark II and the R1 as of late 2024, although it'll probably come into working with newer firmware. It normally locks either in the A position or in the active aperture position, and in order to get it back and forth across this boundary, you have to pull this towards the front of the lens. Now, A simply means that it's controlled on the camera like every EOS lens has been since 1987. This selects apertures manually. It should work in video mode, but in still picture mode, it won't work except for the newest cameras. And what's really bizarre is there are no click stops. So for me, this is kind of silly because the feedback in my viewfinder is delayed by a fraction of a second. So unlike looking at this lens scale here, which is fairly obvious where we're tuned, looking through the viewfinder, it's delayed, which makes it really, it's hard to explain. But try adjusting this with the image that you're seeing through the viewfinder delayed by a fraction of a second, then you wind up doing a lot of hunting. And because there's no clicks, it's just bizarre. So I still prefer, for still shooting, to shoot it in A. The reason for this particular kind of grip is it's actually gear teeth, which for certain follow focus rigs, you can control it remotely by that. This is Canon's smallest and lightest 35-1.4 of all time. It's ultra sharp, and it works great for the things you want to use it. Optically, it's ultra sharp, it has great bokeh, but what's bizarre is it is a little more susceptible to flare, which becomes more visible at the smaller apertures at which we normally shoot in daylight. And so one sucker thing to watch out for is, this tricked me a few times until I figured it out, is that when you're focusing and composing even in broad daylight, the lens is usually fairly wide open. And some of the ghosts and flare don't become as obvious until you stop down, and instead of being a big giant circle of flare that you don't quite notice, it becomes a smaller blob that becomes apparent. So make sure to use a depth of field preview when you're shooting into the light to make sure you don't have any ghosts that won't appear until after you play back your pictures, which are exposed at the smaller aperture as opposed to just looking through the finder composing, which are usually seen at a larger aperture. Ways to work around that is, historically, I just use my hand and block the sun so it doesn't shine on my lens. I don't use hoods. But something rather good and something better than most lenses by far is this included hood. The hood has a catch, so it actually locks in place, which is nice. It won't come off. It is a fixed focal length lens, so you can design an effective hood. See how deep it is? This works really well in the real world. So this is probably a hood that you would want to use on your lenses as opposed to all of my other lenses with which I never use the hood. And of course, it goes like that to store it. It has a front filter thread. Sadly, it's made of plastic, like most lenses today. You also have a rear gel filter slot, and there's a filter adapter that comes with this, so you can use gel filters. Of course, like most things Canon, it's quality made in Japan. It's not offshore to some second or third world country like Nikon and Sony do today, which is one of the many reasons that I personally prefer Canon for my work, just because I feel better using something made in the first world and not offshored to save the manufacturer money. Autofocus is about as fast as most 35mm f1.4 lenses. There's nothing unusual there, despite the new technology. Focus breathing, which is the image changing size as you focus from near to far, which is important for movies. The image from this lens grows as focused more closely. Although it's not a large amount, it does grow. The bokeh is excellent. Here's a shot made at f1.4, and you'll see the backgrounds aren't exactly that far out of focus, but they're not bothersome. They're soft and smooth, and they don't bother us, which is as it should be. If I stop down here to f2.8, you'll see they're still not disturbing. Same thing for 5.6. Things are becoming in focus, but there's no false resolution or edges that are visible, as oftentimes happen with other lenses. So this is great. There's no distortion as shot because the Canon camera is all correct for it electronically. If you shoot RAW and take the data and convert it into an image in other software elsewhere, well, good luck. I don't bother with RAW, and depending on your software, if it doesn't read then correct for the lens internally, then you might get distortion. But that's the way it goes. Fall off again is corrected electronically. It's not a concern. If you turn off the correction and deliberately go looking for fall off, there's a little bit at 1.4, but from f2 on, again, it's not even obvious. We don't need thin filters. I can stack several 67mm standard filters on full frame, and it works just great, so feel free to use your grads and your polarizers to your heart's content. Macro, you know what gets my gourd is the first SLR lenses focus down to a foot or 0.3 meters, and that's the same for this. So it doesn't get any closer than any other 35mm f1.4 ever has. However, it is ultra sharp. Mechanically, it's got a metal mount. Everything else is plastic. The internals, I can't really determine what it's made out of. Canon doesn't make any junk, but it is a plastic lens on the outside, which is par for the course in 2024. Thank goodness it has an auto manual focus switch, and it does have a programmable button, which is usually autofocus lock, or in your camera you can program it as you like. Is it sharp? Of course. Here's a random photo library, and if you zoom in, you'll see even at f1.4, in the corner or sides of the image, it's ultra sharp. Spherochromatism is color fringes, usually green or magenta, on out-of-focus highlights, which is typical with fast, moderate to long focus lenses. And this lens, oddly, has more spherochromatism than I thought. You'll see here's a sample image, and as I zoom in, you'll see the background out of focus tends to have green fringes. The foreground tends to have magenta. The reason that's a little weird is this is about the same as Canon's first EF 35mm f1.4L back in around the 1990s. And then the EF 35mm f1.4L Mark II had some special blue refractive compound that eliminated most of the spherochromatism. So it's peculiar that this lens goes back to about the same amount as the earlier lens had. Does it matter? Not necessarily. Depending on what you're shooting, if you have green foliage in the background, this actually makes the foliage softer. So it's your choice. You can use whatever lens you want. I got on my R5 Mark II about 4 stops of real-world improvement for image stabilization purely from inside the camera. The lens itself has no stabilization, and I find that half of my shots at 1/4 of a second are perfectly tripod-equivalently sharp on my 45-megapixel R5 Mark II with the stabilization on, and I could only get down to about 1/45 of a second to the same standard of sharpness with the stabilization turned off. Sunstars are relatively mild. What's nice is it has an 11-bladed diaphragm, but the way it's shaped, I only get 22-pointed Sunstars at, for the most part, only the smallest apertures. I like Sunstars because they're a visual clue to people that something is really a brilliant point of light, but to each their own. This is an unusual special purpose lens. It's special purpose today because 35mm f1.4s aren't as necessary as they were back in the ancient days of film. Because with film, anything above ISO 100 started to look really bad. With digital, 640, 1600 still looks magnificent when you need it. So I prefer to shoot my slower lens for my nature and landscape shots. But if you're doing sports in dim light, if you're doing action or people moving or doing reporting photography, by all means, this is a great lens to have because you've got the faster apertures. So you have your choice of shooting at a faster shutter speed or a lower, cleaner ISO. And certainly if you're shooting in extremely dark conditions, then it's great to have this f1.4 lens. Just know that because it doesn't zoom, it's not likely to be the only lens you would have with you. But again, that's a very personal choice, and that's why Canon makes so many different lenses. I'm Ken Rockwell. You can see the full review with all the sample images in their original files and far more details and everything about this lens at kenrockwell.com. The link is in my description. I thank you very much for watching kenrockwell.com and kenrockwell.tv. Thanks again for watching.